Hello, Sammy here from the Gateway team, and I am back with my final installment of my top 3 anime antagonists of all time. Last video I spoke about Sato from Arjun. You can check that video out if you haven't seen it. But for now, let's jump into the final antagonist and final antagonist type. Antagonist type 3 is the character whose worldview is intrinsically linked to their sense of self. They have a value or a principle that is so important to them that nothing, no matter how obvious or prescient, will change their mind, even if it's offered up to them on a silver plate. However, sometimes, when these characters are written well, something profound will happen to them which leaves a little room for doubt. And they are sent on an epic journey of self-discovery which elicits the kind of change that is usually preserved for the protagonist. For me, no character embodies this attribute more than Inspector Heinrich Lunge from Naoki Urasawa's Monster. Now, I'm sure many people watching this will be shook that I didn't pick Johan here, who did very nearly make this list, but I always personally felt more of a connection to Lunge for the reasons I just listed. For those who don't know, Monster is set in the early 1990s in Germany, where a brilliant neurosurgeon, Dr. Tenma, has moved over from Japan and seemingly has it all. He's being prepared to take over the whole hospital from his fiance's father, who is the head physician, mostly keen on profits from medicine, and his daughter shares a similarly vapid and materialistic view of the world. Dr. Tenma, who takes his Hippocratic oath incredibly seriously, ends up in an impossibly difficult moral dilemma, which leads him to choosing to save the life of a small child who has come in with a gunshot wound, rather than be pulled out of surgery to operate on the mayor. After the mayor dies, after receiving what they perceive to be insufficient care from an inferior physician, Dr. Tenma finds his life turned upside down, as his career is torpedoed by his ex-father-in-law, and he is unceremoniously dumped by his fiancée, who thinks he's a naive fool. To make matters worse, the boy he saved turns out to essentially be the Antichrist himself, who ends up murdering the chief of medicine and Dr. Tenma's replacement, and later frames Tenma for the murders, forcing him to go on the run to clear his name, and ultimately embark on a journey to stop Johan, the young boy with the gunshot wound. Now, I left a ton of stuff out there, but TLDR, watch Monster. It's incredible. Now, long story short, the officer tasked with the Tenma case is Inspector Lunge, who is a dogged, cold, and determined man. He obsessively pursues Tenma, believing him to be responsible for the murders committed across Germany. Lunge is hell-bent on pursuing his ideal of what he believes justice to be. Lunge is a highly analytical and incredibly intelligent man, and he is almost robotic in his nature. He possesses a mnemonic where, when taking in information, his fingers start to type in the air as if inputting data into a computer. This is his way of methodically and accurately logging information in his brain. And whilst it may be highly effective at allowing him to store information, it doesn't allow for much nuance or suggestion. Lunge is a joyless, stubborn, and bloody-minded workaholic who is completely obsessive over his job and proudly states that no case he has ever taken on has ever ended without a resolution. There's an incredible sequence early on which depicts Lunge's obsessive work ethic over the Tenma case when he ends up losing his entire family. It works in a kind of montage sequence when he comes home, sees his family eating dinner, barely acknowledges their existence, and just heads off into his study to continue work on the case. This happens almost on a loop. Then later in the montage, he comes home and his wife and daughter are all packed and ready to leave, and he has the exact same response as always, barely acknowledging them and walking off into his study to work. He's completely resigned to their want to leave, and he even seems to understand it. He just has bigger things to attend to, or perhaps more accurately, lacks the emotional capacity to be able to handle the reality of the situation. Socially, he ain't great. In many ways, Lunge is actually quite similar to Inspector Javert from Les Miserables. Please, let's pretend Russell Crowe's interpretation never existed.
This I swear by the stars.
He sees the world in a very rigid and logical manner. The fairy tale-like nature of Johan's existence is not a possibility to Lunge. Therefore, his pursuit of Tenma becomes completely irrational and borderline insane. It appears that the only way he can justify his sense of self, along with his callous and capricious actions in his personal life, is to bring Tenma to justice. Nothing else matters. The great difference between the two is that when Lunge's entire worldview is inevitably brought into question by the discovery that Johan may indeed be real, he reluctantly and slowly accepts it and begins the process of change. Whereas Javert, when faced with the exact same existential predicament, chooses to kill himself rather than face up to the fact that he may have been wrong all along. Lunge represents the more existential and nihilistic themes that are associated with Monster. He and Tenma are polar opposite characters, particularly in the early part of the show. Lunge represents the darker, crueler, and more judgmental side of humanity, that which is unable to forgive or accept that which cannot be initially understood. Despite his excellent methods of deduction and analytical skill, he is actually driven by his need to have his worldview upheld, which is tied to his very sense of self and his whole reason for existing. All evidence that may contradict that be damned. One thing I will say is that Lunge does indeed become somewhat fatiguing to the audience after a while, because you're like, come on, man. Surely you can see it now. And to Lunge's credit, he does eventually come to see the existence of Johan, even though he is an almost mythical and supernatural-like force, completely at odds with Lunge's view of the world. He does eventually accept that he was wrong, and even works to help Tenma in the end. One of my favorite scenes in the whole show is when Lunge eventually apologizes to Tenma, but he does so with his back turned to him the whole time. A genius little touch from the writer. Here we have a man who is so stubborn and ruthlessly logical, who could never admit he was wrong, now doing so to the very person who was the subject of his ire and obsession. And even though this is a massive moment of change for the character, he hasn't changed so much that he's no longer himself. Lunge is apologizing and admitting fault, but he is still too stubborn and proud to be able to look Tenma in the eye. Fucking brilliant. This is what makes Lunge one of my all-time favorite characters. He goes through probably the biggest change of any character in the show, but it's believable. It's still in line with everything we've been told about the character before. He's not a completely new person. He's just a changed version of himself. We see this at the very end where he starts trying to reconnect with his daughter. He doesn't just suddenly turn into some loving, doting family man and everyone just suddenly forgives him all his sins, like, say, Sasuke in Naruto. I mean, he legitimately tried to murder Sakura along with everyone in the village. And then after he has a Deus Ex Machina change of heart, when he still goes back on again, when he ends up fighting Naruto at the very end, after all the bullshit he's put everyone through, everyone kind of just goes, well, water under the bridge. Welcome back, bro. P.S. Do you want to marry me? I know you tried to kill me just before, but lol, you're so hot. Don't worry about it, lol jokes. God, that ending was a fucking mess. And now there are characters in the freaking moon? Anyway, don't get me started on Boruto. The fact is, Sasuke becomes a completely different person. This is the thing. The change is so abrupt and makes little to no sense, whereas what we see in Monster is the opposite of that. For Lunge, he simply starts sending his daughter some emails and begins the process of reconnection. He's changed, but he's still fundamentally himself. That's verisimilitude. That's how people actually change. Incrementally, subtly, and through their own ways and means. And that is what Monster depicts so well. Urasawa is a genius, and if you haven't watched Monster, go and do so immediately. It's a bloody great adaptation from Madhouse Studios. Well, there it is, my top 3 anime antagonists of all time. It was so difficult to whittle this down just to 3, and I'm sure many of you will be a little bit aggrieved that I missed your favorite antagonist, so hit me up in the comments if you want to let me know who yours are. This is just my personal opinion, and I had so much fun breaking down why I found these characters enjoyable, and I hope you did too. Now, I have missed some others, and I'll put some honorable mentions in. That is, of course, Kotomine Kire from Fate Zero, Sosuke Aizen from Bleach, Bradley and Scar from Full Metal Alchemist Brotherhood, and Hisoka from Hunter x Hunter. If you liked these antagonists, you can go and check out our podcast. In episode 3, we talked about the seinen demographic, where we cover both Psycho Pass and Monster. And if you like a little bit more of an in-depth analysis, go and check out that episode of our podcast. I hope you liked this video series. This is part of a new bunch of bite-sized videos that we'll be doing on our YouTube channel for Gateway to Anime. Thanks so much. Catch you next time.